Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we're taking on a truly monumental topic. The slow, agonizing, yet historically inevitable collapse of the Mughal Empire.
It's a huge one.
It really is. I mean, this wasn't just the fall of a single dynasty or, a few bad choices. It was the slow disintegration of one of the largest, richest, and most powerful state structures the world has ever seen, dominating the Indian subcontinent for centuries.
That's absolutely right. And when you dive into the immense stack of sources detailing this decline, which, it spans roughly a century and a half from the late 17th century onward, the mission isn't just to track a series of lost battles or failed rulers.
No.
Our goal is to extract the crucial insights. We need to identify the compounding factors, the deep internal rot that infected the system, and the external pressures that ultimately delivered the final fatal blows. It's really a study in structural failure.
And the structure itself is so key to understanding that failure. Our sources, they immediately define the nature of the Mughal state, framing it essentially as a political and military pyramid.
It's the essential definition we have to start with. The Mughal Empire was fundamentally a war state.
A war state?
Yeah. Its stability, its wealth, its continued existence depended entirely on its military strength and the ability of the center to command the periphery. When we look at that pyramid, the emperor, he sits at the top, the sovereign source of all authority.
Okay.
Below him is the military aristocracy, the powerful nobles, we often call them the mansabdars, who'd administer and fight on his behalf. And then at the massive base, you have the actual army, the soldiers, and horsemen.
And what's so compelling and really tragic about this collapse is that deep terminal problems started to emerge at all three of these levels.
Simultaneously.
Right, simultaneously, creating this perfect storm of self-destruction. A simultaneous crisis across the entire hierarchy. And we are going to start naturally at the very peak of that pyramid with the failure of leadership and high-level policy. We have to begin with the reign that historians often cite as the turning point, the seemingly successful but ultimately fatal decisions of Emperor Aurangzeb. Okay, so let's unpack this apparent contradiction. Aurangzeb reigns for nearly 50 years, and he pushes the empire to its absolute greatest geographical extent. It covers almost the entirety of the subcontinent. Yet the sources are completely unanimous. His reign marks the beginning of the end. So how can the moment of greatest physical achievement also be the turning point toward terminal decline?
Well, it's a classic case of imperial overreach married to some really catastrophic policy choices. The sources use a powerful metaphor. The empire became like an inflated balloon.
An inflated balloon.
It just grew so vast under Aurangzeb that effective centralized control from Delhi became, structurally impossible. In the medieval era, with primitive communication systems, ruling a territory that large meant that the imperial authority was diluted with every single mile it stretched southward. The sheer scale was just unsustainable.
But the physical size wasn't the only problem. This leads directly into what historians consider his greatest political failure. The inability to secure buy-in from the diverse populations he was ruling.
Exactly. I mean, you have to remember the Mughals ruled over a predominantly non-Muslim population. The great emperors before him, especially Akbar, they understood this. They knew that to successfully govern an empire of this size and diversity, you needed political legitimacy.
You needed people on your side.
You needed the willing support of the people, especially the local ruling elites like the Rajputs and other Hindu chiefs. Aurangzeb fundamentally failed to grasp this necessity. He chose rigidity over pragmatism.
And he actively alienated these groups through policies of religious intolerance. This wasn't just a philosophical preference, was it? It had profound, real-world political and military consequences.
Oh, absolutely. When he reimposed the jizya, that's the poll tax on non-Muslims, when he destroyed certain temples, he wasn't just making a theological statement. He was mobilizing political resistance.
Right.
This actively angered and pushed major, powerful non-Muslim groups, the Rajputs, who had been crucial allies and generals for generations.
The backbone of the army in many cases.
The Sikhs, the Jats, and most famously the Marathas, into open, organized, and often brutal rebellion. He took existing internal friction and just turned it into full-scale, devastating internal warfare that consumed resources and legitimacy.
And the single biggest drain, the issue that truly broke his back, as the sources suggest, was a continuous resource-draining war in the Deccan region against those very Marathas. Can you just elaborate on the scale of this commitment?
This conflict was decades long. It essentially occupied the entire second half of his reign. Aurangzeb personally moved his court and his massive army south, so he was effectively ruling from a military camp for years on end.
Wow.
The Deccan campaigns were intended to crush the Marathas and integrate the vast, rich southern territories, but the Marathas were masters of guerrilla warfare. They called it Ganimi Kava.
So they wouldn't fight big set-piece battles.
No, they refused. They just exhausted the gigantic, slow-moving Mughal army. This endless war completely emptied the state treasury. It required continuous reinforcement of men and supplies across thousands of miles. The source material doesn't mince words. This war broke Aurangzeb's back, not just physically, but financially. It fatally weakened the military establishment and left a gaping hole in the imperial accounts that could never be filled.
So Aurangzeb pushed the empire to its geographic limit, broke the military financial machine keeping it running, and alienated the very populations necessary to administer it. But he was at least a rigorous, hands-on despot.
Oh, very much so.
So what happens when the next generation inherits this broken, over-leveraged system?
This is where the structural vulnerability of the Mughal system becomes painfully clear. As we established, the government was a personal despotism. The entire apparatus administration, finance, military command, even law, was reliant absolutely on the intelligence, the administrative rigor, and the sheer force of personality of the ruler at the top.
The emperor was the central pillar.
The central pillar. So when the quality of the rulers just collapsed after Aurangzeb's long, exhausting reign, the entire political edifice lost its stabilizing force.
And the succession of rulers that followed Aurangzeb didn't just lack rigor. I mean, they seem to have been actively, almost comically, unfit for the monumental task of stabilizing a crumbling war state. Let's look at the specific memorable examples of these later Mughals, because their incompetence is, well, it's legendary.
They are more than just footnotes of failure. They demonstrate the immediate consequences of a system relying on DNA rather than merit. First, you have Badr Shah Amilist. He succeeded his father, Aurangzeb, at an old age. He was over 60. And he was so eager to reverse his father's rigidity that he earned the nickname Shah-e-Bekabar, the Heedless King.
The Heedless King, why?
Because he tried to please everyone. He was handing out unsustainable titles, honors, and revenue rights to every noble who asked, just desperately trying to buy loyalty. This worsened the existing financial crisis exponentially.
And these attempts to buy loyalty seem only to have encouraged further degradation.
Mm-hmm.
Then you have Jahandar Shah, who was notorious for being wildly extravagant. He was known for his scandalous public escapades with a courtesan named Lal Kunwar. His reign was brief, but very destructive.
Following him was Farrukhshah, who is perhaps most damningly described simply as a coward.
A coward.
In a military aristocracy that prides itself on gallantry and leading troops, having a coward on the throne is just an insult to the entire ruling class. It destroys respect and military morale immediately.
And then the ruler who really symbolizes the total decline of imperial focus, Muhammad Shah.
Muhammad Shah. His reign lasted nearly 30 years, and he is universally known as Rangila, which means colorful or pleasurable.
The nickname tells you everything.
It really does. He was entirely disengaged, spending his time on trivial pursuits, overseeing animal fights, indulging in wine and women, all while the empire literally fractured around him. Key decisions were ignored for days or weeks while he was, otherwise occupied. This wasn't just poor leadership, it was a total dereliction of duty.
And even later, we see figures like Ahmad Shah, who would reportedly spend weeks or even months at a time cloistered away in his extended harem, completely inaccessible to administrators or generals seeking urgent directives. This paints a picture of just utter disconnection from the realities of governance.
And this rapid succession of weak, inefficient, often absurdly incompetent rulers had two immediate terminal consequences. First, they utterly failed to suppress the regional revolts and financial demands that Aurangzeb had initiated. The problem just metastasized.
And second,
they became mere puppets. Unable to command genuine loyalty or military respect, they were victims of conspiracies, offering merely a desirable but empty seat of power for the powerful feuding nobles to fight over. This created a profound, dangerous political vacuum right at the center of the empire.
And that vacuum brings us directly to part 2, the systemic instability that paralyzed the state. When the emperor is incapable or absent, the power shifts immediately to the nobles. But before we discuss who took charge, we have to underscore a core systemic flaw. The Mughals never institutionalized a clear law of succession.
This is such a crucial distinction between the Mughal state and, say, successful European monarchies of the same era. The Mughals never adopted primogeniture or any clear rules.
So it wasn't automatically the eldest son.
Not at all. Every time a ruler died, it meant an inevitable, bloody war of succession among the princes, often assisted by ambitious nobles. This perpetual instability was a design flaw that, when combined with the string of weak rulers after Aurangzeb, allowed the aristocracy to seize effective control.
And they took full advantage. After 1712, the powerful nobles stopped pretending they were simply servants of the throne. They began using the rival princes, the sons and nephews of the previous emperors, as mere tools or pawns to gain power for themselves. This is the official start of the era of the kingmakers.
And the sources name the figures who absolutely destroyed imperial stability through this practice. Zulfikar Khan was an early example, but the most infamous were the powerful Sayyid brothers Abdullah Khan and Hussein Ali Khan.
The Sayyid brothers.
Their power was breathtaking. They weren't fighting for the stability of the empire. They were fighting for the administrative control of the revenue and military appointments. That's all they cared about.
And how powerful were they specifically? What's the historical evidence that shows their complete control over the imperial title?
Well, the sheer measure of their audacity is in the numbers. The Sayyid brothers alone appointed 4 different kings in rapid succession between 1713 and 1719.
4 kings in 6 years.
Exactly. They essentially sat on the throne, determining who wore the crown next, often keeping the successor in place for only a few months or even weeks before deposing or assassinating them when they proved inconvenient. This level of manipulation utterly destroyed the sanctity and authority of the imperial title. The political machinery was visibly broken.
And just think about the psychological impact this plotting had on the ruling class. If you were a noble and you watch 4 kings deposed in 6 years, you are no longer concerned with imperial duty.
Not at all.
Your focus narrows entirely to personal survival, self-enrichment, and factional loyalty. Any sense of patriotism or duty to the greater state just vanishes, replaced entirely by this corrosive greed.
And this leads us to the fundamental philosophical problem of the Mughal state structure itself.
Let's analyze the fundamental purpose of the state, as historians have defined it. It wasn't built as a modern government focused on public welfare or long-term growth. The sources label it essentially as a police state. What does that practical definition imply about its long-term viability?
It implies a profoundly limited focus. For the Mughals, the central government was fundamentally concerned with only 2 functions. First, maintaining law and order, keeping the roads safe, suppressing local banditry.
Basic security.
Basic security. And second, which was arguably the most important, collecting revenue or taxes. That was it. The state was not focused on public investment, infrastructure development, education, or deep societal integration in the modern sense. It was a machine designed to extract wealth and ensure local stability for that extraction.
And this limited transactional focus directly magnified the earlier failure we discussed under Aurangzeb, the failure to forge a unified national identity.
Exactly. The Mughals were a highly successful conquering dynasty, but they never truly managed to knit together the highly diverse groups of the subcontinent into a composite nation. Akbar had made serious, sophisticated attempts at achieving harmony, incorporating local elites, and respecting diverse practices. But Aurangzeb's bigotry, followed by the distraction and incompetence of his successors, utterly ruined those foundational efforts. The political unity was always fragile, held together primarily by force and tax collection.
So when the force faltered and the tax collection became unreliable, the loyalty just evaporated.
Precisely. The consequence was that a huge number of local Indian chiefs, powerful landowners, and regional ruling groups increasingly saw the distant Mughal state, especially its center in Delhi, not as a source of legitimacy or protector, but as foreigners.
As an occupying force.
As an occupying, taxing enemy. They felt no deep political or emotional obligation to the center, and they were actively seeking opportunities to declare their freedom, or at least autonomy, from imperial rule. The fragile edifice had no deep societal foundation.
Okay, so if the center of the empire was political power, the circulatory system was the economic and administrative structure. And for the Mughals, that heart was the Mansabdari system. We need to define this administrative system clearly because its decay is the single most cited structural cause of collapse.
The Mansabdari system was the genius innovation of Emperor Akbar. It was the comprehensive framework for organizing the entire ruling class, both military and civil administration combined. A mansadar was essentially a rank holder, a high-ranking noble appointed based on loyalty and merit, and critically, his ability to maintain a specific number of horsemen and troops for imperial service.
And in exchange for this military duty, he was paid with a jagir. What exactly was a jagir?
A jagir was a temporary grant of a landed estate. It wasn't ownership of the land itself, but the right to collect the land revenue, the taxes from that area. It was essentially payment via delegated tax authority.
Okay.
And the brilliance of the system was that jagirs were supposed to be transferred frequently to prevent the mansabdar from developing deep local roots and becoming an independent power base. It was a fluid system connecting loyalty, military duty, and payment seamlessly.
That sounds like a beautifully efficient military administrative machine. So where did the decay start? What were the fatal structural changes that ruined Akbar's genius?
There were two major systemic failings. First, and fatally, the system became hereditary. As the emperors weakened, nobles used their influence to secure appointments for their sons and relatives. High-ranking jobs were no longer awarded based on skill, merit, or military capability. They were just passed down.
Which is the death knell for any meritocracy.
Exactly. It floods the administration with incompetent and less loyal individuals.
And the second flaw concerned access to power.
It became a closed corporation. The highest ranks of the nobility, so the most lucrative jagirs and the most powerful military commands, became dominated by specific, powerful ethnic and religious groups, particularly the Irani, who were of Persian heritage, and the Turani, who were of Central Asian Turkish heritage.
So it shut people out.
It shut out capable men from other classes, including indigenous Indian Muslims and Hindu Rajputs, further narrowing the base of loyalty and competence.
And this systemic decay fundamentally changed the lifestyle and the purpose of the Mughal nobility itself. They shifted from being frontline commanders to court parasites.
The sources detailed this decline in vivid, almost shocking detail. The nobles lost all military discipline. They spent less time drilling troops and more time living lives of staggering, extreme luxury. They invested huge amounts of money in enormous harems, massive retinues of personal servants, lavish palaces, and incredible pomp and show.
Their focus shifted entirely from the battlefield to the imperial court.
Entirely. Instead of competing in gallantry, which meant genuine military bravery and skill on campaign, they began competing in flamboyance and flattery at court. They spent their wealth maintaining appearances and buying influence, not training armies.
And the net result?
The net result was that when the empire desperately needed skilled generals, military strategists, and able administrators to face the Marathas or Nadir Shah, it was left with an elite cast of pampered, soft, and often cowardly courtiers. The military leadership had just evaporated.
The stage is set for the inevitable financial breakdown. The nobles are spending lavishly, but the system is producing fewer capable leaders, and the treasury is being drained by those Deccan Wars. This confluence defines the Jagirdari crisis, which historian Satish Chandra identified as the key economic factor. How does he define this crisis, and why is it so structural?
Chandra defines the crisis as the moment the empire's available income, what he calls the social surplus extracted from the land, was no longer sufficient to pay for the immense administrative costs and fund the ruling class's ever-increasing expected high standard of life.
So the system was designed to reward luxury, but the revenue simply could no longer support it. The financial math just stopped working.
It no longer works. And if you break down that math, it's a disastrous supply and demand imbalance in medieval governance. On the demand side, the number of mansabdars, the nobles needing payment and thus requiring a jagir, increased dramatically throughout Aurangzeb's later years and into the 18th century, because every prince or noble needed to reward his followers to solidify his own position. But on the supply side, the amount of good, profitable land, the productive jagirs, did not increase. In fact, due to continuous warfare and peasant revolts, the quality and profitability of the available land actually decreased.
So you have more mouths to feed and less food on the table. What does this shortage trigger politically?
It triggers fierce, unhealthy competition. Since the jagirs were the only source of power, wealth, and status, the shortage fueled the vicious group politics that destroyed central authority. Nobles were forced to fight each other, bribe officials, and intrigue relentlessly just to secure a profitable piece of land rather than serving the distant emperor.
And this competition organized itself into the definitive court factions of the 18th century, which became more loyal to their factional leaders than to the imperial throne.
That's critical. We see the emergence of these identifiable, self-interested blocs vying for control over the limited revenue resources. You had the powerful Irani faction, often led by figures like Assad Khan and Zulfikar Khan. Then the Turani faction, dominated by figures like Nizam-ul-Mulk. And finally, the Hindustani faction, which included indigenous nobles and the infamous Sayyid brothers.
And these weren't political parties.
No, not at all. They were armed, aristocratic gangs competing for the finite economic spoils of a collapsing state.
And the ultimate sign of this extreme self-interest has to be the treachery that followed. How did this internal greed manifest when faced with an external threat?
The breakdown of loyalty was absolute. The sources document the horrific betrayal that occurred during the invasion of Nadir Shah. Nobles like Nizam-ul-Mulk and Sadiq Khan, instead of uniting to defend the empire, used the Persian invasion as leverage against their internal court rivals.
That's unbelievable.
Sadiq Khan, for instance, negotiated directly with Nadir Shah, betraying imperial secrets and providing advice to the invading force purely out of spite and self-preservation. He was focused on destroying his rivals rather than protecting the throne. When your ruling class is willing to intrigue with a foreign invader against its own emperor, the state is functionally dead.
We've tracked the rod from the top with weak emperors, through the administrative core with the Jagodari crisis and the nobility's corruption. Now we see the consequences manifest in the final operational breakdown, starting with the collapse of the military, the very institution that was supposed to be the backbone of the war state.
The military decline was profound because it reflected every failure we've already discussed. It was no longer the disciplined, mobile fighting force that had conquered the subcontinent.
And the first major issue, tied directly to the Mansabdari decay, was loyalty. The soldiers were paid by their direct Mansabdar, the noble who granted their contract and provided their salary.
Which means loyalty ran vertically, not horizontally, to the emperor. If a Mansabdar decided to join a rebellion or simply withhold his troops from imperial service to fight his own personal rivals, his troops followed him.
So it was a decentralized payment system.
Exactly. And it resulted in profound indiscipline and fractured command structures precisely when unified military response was required. The emperor had an army in name only. In reality, he had several hundred personal contingents whose loyalty was entirely conditional.
And while these internal systems were degrading, the sources indicate a critical failure in external awareness, technological stagnation.
This is key. Military historians point out that while Europe was undergoing rapid advancements in gunpowder weapons, artillery, and disciplined infantry tactics, especially the use of muskets and bayonets, the Mughal army remained largely conservative.
What do they rely on?
They relied heavily on vast numbers of heavy cavalry and older artillery techniques. They simply failed to adapt the technology that was fundamentally changing warfare, leaving them critically vulnerable to both regional powers like the Marathas and European companies who employed modern, fast-loading weaponry.
And then there's the sheer physical size of the army on the march, which the sources memorably describe as an armed rabble.
That description paints such a powerful picture of inefficiency. The Mughal army was unwieldy and notoriously slow. When a noble or an emperor went on campaign, the army carried a massive tail.
And this wasn't just supplies.
No, it included huge camps, sprawling markets, thousands of servants, wives, children, and non-combatants, all the dependents necessary to maintain the lavish lifestyle of the nobles and their retinues. The ratio of actual fighters to non-combatants was staggering. This made the force impossible to maneuver quickly, vulnerable to surprise attacks, and it meant they constantly consumed local resources, further alienating the populace they marched through. It was a moving city, not a fighting machine.
And the proof of this impotence arrived swiftly and very publicly.
Oh, absolutely. The military failure was undeniable when, in 1737, the Marathas, a guerrilla force that Aurangzeb had spent 25 years trying to crush, were able to openly plunder the suburbs of Delhi itself. The imperial capital was undefended.
And just 2 years later?
2 years later, in 1739, the Persian invader Nadir Shah effortlessly shattered the main Mughal army at Karnal and sacked the capital. The state could not protect its own head.
The financial collapse was, of course, inextricably linked to the military decline. We trace the initial drain back to Shah Jahan's expensive construction projects like the Taj Mahal, but Aurangzeb's Deccan Wars really finished the job. What was the mechanism of this financial exhaustion?
The Deccan Wars were like a bottomless pit. They consumed not only the annual revenue, but also the generational reserves of wealth that the great emperors had built up. The sheer cost of maintaining that massive army so far south for decades, constantly replacing lost soldiers, horses, and material, pushed the imperial budget into a state of chronic deficit.
So by the time of the later Mughals,
By their time, the central treasury was essentially bankrupt. It was relying on the unreliable future promise of revenue that was never fully delivered.
but the financial disaster wasn't just confined to Delhi's balance sheet. It caused an agrarian disaster across the countryside.
That cycle of violence just destroyed the economic base. Constant wars, particularly the relentless Maratha raids across north and central India, led to the widespread destruction of crops, villages, and infrastructure. This meant that the highly taxed peasant population could no longer farm productively or generate the revenue that the state demanded.
And the human cost of this led to complete social disorder.
Yes. The peasants, crushed by impossibly high revenue demands and facing continuous destruction from warring armies, they had no recourse. They abandoned farming in large numbers. Many migrated, but many others were forced to take up arms and turn to robbery and banditry just to survive.
Which further destabilized the countryside.
And crucially, destroyed the revenue base that the Mughals relied upon, accelerating that financial death spiral.
So you get this devastating feedback loop. The vendor needs money to fight the wars. But the wars destroy the source of the money, forcing the center to demand even more, leading to revolt and further financial ruin.
And critically, this is where the new autonomous states capitalized. Successful nobles and powerful zamindars who had secured regional power simply stopped paying revenue to the central government in Delhi. Yet the emperor and the remaining nobles in the capital refused to curb their hereditary lavish spending, accelerating the financial ruin of the center and making their own demise a certainty.
We also have to revisit the sheer geography of India. Our sources state clearly that the empire was simply too large and unwieldy for the medieval communication and transportation systems to manage effectively. The center was weak, but the periphery was beginning to thrive.
That geographical reality meant that the moment the central military authority weakened, the regional powers were ready to assert themselves. And this wasn't a sudden development. Even during Aurangzeb's rule, powerful regional groups, the Sikhs in the Punjab, the Jats near Agra, the Rajputs in Rajasthan, and the Marathas in the Deccan, were already fighting fiercely for political independence or regional autonomy.
So it was a constant drain.
A massive, persistent drain that fundamentally weakened the empire over decades.
And the key local agents in this transition were the zemindars. These hereditary landowners, local rajas and thakurs, were absolutely crucial for the Mughals, acting as the local intermediaries for revenue collection and law enforcement.
They were the linchpin of the local economy and politics. And as they witnessed the Central Empire's spectacular weakness and financial ruin, they stopped seeing the emperor as their ultimate authority. They saw opportunity. They began actively withholding revenue, raising their own local armies, and establishing autonomous or semi-autonomous states like Awadh, Bengal, and Hyderabad that paid only nominal homage to the distant, irrelevant emperor. Loyalty shifted from the distant court to the proximate hereditary authority of the local zamindar or raja.
So the Mughal structure was already collapsing from internal failures, bankruptcy, political treachery, and military decay. But the external shocks, they delivered the coup de grace, utterly shattering what little prestige and wealth remained. We have to start with the Marathas, who were simultaneously an internal regional challenge and perhaps the most significant external factor to the central power.
The Marathas, under their various confederacy leaders, were relentless and ideologically motivated. They were not merely seeking to collect revenue. Their movement, particularly under the ideal of Hindu Padshahi, promoted the idea of a Hindu Rashtra, or a Hindu nation.
And what did that mean in practical terms?
Well, while this ideal was often pursued through practical military means, it fundamentally necessitated the political destruction of the Muslim Mughal Empire to be realized.
And their impact was devastating to the center's viability.
After Aurangzeb's death, their reach expanded exponentially. They successfully penetrated North India, extracting tribute across vast tracts of territory, and most incredibly, they became the new kingmakers in Delhi.
They were controlling the throne.
They were effectively dictating who would sit on the imperial throne and controlling the politics of the capital by the mid-18th century. Their widespread conquest gave a death blow to the empire's viability, proving definitively that the Mughals could no longer defend their own lands.
If the Marathas were the chronic disease, The great invasions from the northwest were the acute traumatic shocks that bled the empire dry.
The sources single out two major invaders. First, Nadir Shah of Iran, who saw the opportunity presented by the chaos. He attacked in 1738-39. The Battle of Karnal was a military massacre, but the subsequent sack of Delhi was a national humiliation. Nadir Shah spent weeks looting the capital.
And he walked away with immense wealth.
Immense, including the famed Petak throne and the Koh-i-Noor diamond.
What was the lasting impact of that sack?
It was crushing in three ways. First, the financial drain was absolute. The wealth of decades was lost instantly. Second, the psychological damage was irreparable. The Mughals were revealed to the entire subcontinent as utterly helpless, incapable of protecting their own capital or people. And third, the massacre led to widespread fear and depopulation in the imperial heartland, further destroying the tax base.
And this wasn't the end of it. The Afghans followed shortly thereafter.
Correct. Ahmad Shah Abdali of Afghanistan, who had served under Nadir Shah, learned the weakness of India well. He invaded India an astonishing 7 times between 1748 and 1767. His raids further drained the remaining treasury, shattered the Maratha power that was at the famous Third Battle of Panipat in 1761, and most importantly, broadcasted the Mughal military's profound, irreversible weakness to every power bloc, foreign and domestic, across the region.
So the table is set. Internal rot, financial ruin, military impotence, and devastating external invasions. This chaos was essentially a flashing green light for the European trading companies. They didn't cause the initial decline, but they utilized it with brutal efficiency.
Sources confirm that. The British East India Company and the French Company, initially just trading entities, saw the disintegration as an existential opportunity. As the Mughal administrative system collapsed, they stepped into the power vacuum. They began involving themselves directly in court intrigues, providing funds, trained armies, and support to rival factions of nobles and princes, often playing them against each other.
They were basically mercenaries for hire, providing the military competence the Mughals had lost.
Exactly. They were the highly professional, disciplined fighting force the Mughals lacked, and they were fighting for economic and political control, not just trade. In the words of the historical documents, they hastened the process of disintegration, systematically replacing Mughal authority in key, wealthy regions like Bengal and South India through the middle of the 18th century.
What I find fascinating, though, is that despite the complete political and military collapse, the idea of the Mughal emperor survived for nearly another century, even into the early British colonial period. Why did this hollow title retain such weight?
This is a powerful point about the nature of legitimacy in India. The Mughals had established such a deep historical and cultural footprint that even after their power was gone, the imperial title remained the ultimate source of political validation.
So even the rebels wanted his stamp of approval.
Yes. The rebel chiefs, the new independent kings, the powerful Nawabs of Bengal and Awadh, and even the Marathas still sought the emperor's official sanction or formal appointment to legitimize their own autonomous rule. It was a required stamp of approval. And furthermore, these regional powers continued to use Mughal administrative methods, the revenue structures, the bureaucratic titles, proving that while the central structure failed, the underlying bureaucratic framework had an enduring influence.
So we have meticulously covered an entire constellation of causes: egotism, administrative corruption, technological failure, economic math that simply stopped working, and relentless external attack. This brings us to the crucial analytical point for you, our listener. Historians who look at the same evidence disagree vehemently on which cause was the main cause. It's time to synthesize these powerful and often conflicting schools of thought.
This analytical disagreement is essential to understanding the complexity of the collapse. We're not looking for one answer, but a combination. The historical theories generally group into 4 major schools of thought. Those that blame individuals and policies, those that blame the economic structure, those that blame geography, and those that blame regional dynamism.
Let's start with the traditional interpretation, the view that emphasizes the individual agency of the rulers.
This view is most famously championed by early 20th century historians like William Irvine and the great Jadunath Sarkar. They pin the collapse squarely on a failure of leadership and morality. Their argument emphasized the weak, indulgent character of the later Mughals and the subsequent moral and military degeneration of the nobility, who traded gallantry for flattery and luxury.
And what was Sarkar's specific critique of the decisive turning point?
Sarkar viewed Aurangzeb himself as the primary catalyst. He labeled him a religious fanatic and argued that Aurangzeb's bigoted policies, reimposing the jizya, destroying temples, and alienating the Rajputs created an immediate violent backlash. Sarkar famously interpreted the subsequent uprisings by the Marathas and Sikhs, not merely as political resistance, but as a direct Hindu reaction to this perceived persecution. For this school, the problem started at the top and spread downwards.
Okay, so moving beyond personality, the next major school looks beneath the throne to the structural machinery of the state, the economic arguments. This is often called the Aligarh school of historians.
And this is arguably the most influential modern perspective, shifting the blame from the individual emperor to the flawed system itself. The Jagirdari crisis is the cornerstone of this theory, promoted by scholars like Satish Chandra and Athar Ali.
Right.
They argue that the fundamental, unsustainable structural shortage of productive jagirs was the key destabilizing factor. This shortage increased the number of dissatisfied, unemployed, or underpaid nobles, forcing them into intense competition and factional warfare, thereby destroying the central state's ability to govern or trust its own aristocracy. They argue that even if the emperors had been brilliant, the system's mathematical failure would have guaranteed collapse.
There's a related but distinct economic argument that focuses lower down the pyramid, the agrarian crisis, championed by historian Irfan Habib. He looked at the bottom 90% of the population, the peasantry.
Habib utilized extensive data on land revenue and taxation to argue that the Mughal state was overwhelmingly exploitative. The imperial revenue demand was impossibly high, often exceeding 50% of produce. This crushing tax burden, combined with the constant insecurity created by wars and the indifference of the short-term Jagirdars, caused widespread rural poverty.
And how did that relate to the Jagirdari system?
Habib pointed out that because Jagirdars were constantly transferred every few years to prevent them from building local routes, they had no long-term incentive to invest in agricultural development, irrigation, or the welfare of the peasants. Their only goal was to extract maximum revenue in the shortest time possible, further depressing the economic base and leading directly to massive endemic peasant revolts across the countryside. For Habib, the peasant rebellion was the constant factor that prevented stability and drained resources.
Okay, finally, we have the perspectives that focus on geography and regional shifts, arguing that the collapse was less a dramatic implosion and more a kind of natural fracturing.
There are a couple of threads here. First, the Deccan crisis focus, pushed by historians like M.N. Pearson and J.F. Richards. They argue that while other factors contributed, the sheer, sustained, and financially ruinous nature of the decades-long wars in the Deccan against the Marathas was the primary financial drain. They see it as a colossal misallocation of resources that exhausted the imperial center beyond recovery.
And what about the positive growth that was happening in some regions? This leads to the theory of uneven growth and regional rise.
This is a crucial counter-narrative advocated by scholars like Muzaffar Alam and Chitan Singh. They argue that the 18th century wasn't a period of universal decline, but rather one of uneven economic growth. Regions like Awadh, Bengal, and Punjab were actually becoming economically prosperous and administratively robust, often due to local initiatives.
So the empire didn't collapse so much as it decentralized.
In a way, yes. They argue the collapse of the center wasn't inevitable decline, but a natural consequence of these newly rich and powerful local groups, the zamindars and nawabs, asserting their independence and converting economic power into political autonomy. The empire didn't collapse. It simply broke into successful regional successor states that retained the Mughal style of administration.
What an astonishing convergence of forces. When you look at the entire scope, from the moral decay of the individual emperor to the mathematical failure of the revenue system and the technological stagnation of the military, it's clear why this collapse was so total. There wasn't a single point of failure. There were dozens, all compounding at the same time.
And the sources in their final synthesis state that while the economic crisis, specifically the Jagirdari shortage and the agrarian burden, is often considered the generally accepted view for the ultimate structural breakdown, the overriding reality is that there was no single cause, it was a confluence.
The decline was a perfect historical storm. Weak rulers failed to command, corrupt nobles sought personal gain over duty, economic strain stripped the state of funds, and external invasions delivered the final, humiliating blows. All these factors combined to destroy what the historians call the fragile political edifice, and allowed those newly energized, self-interested, local, regional identities to rise up and fill the resulting power vacuum.
The great lesson we extract here, spanning nearly 2 centuries of slow collapse, is how quickly internal rot luxury, corruption, and competing greed among the ruling elite can dismantle a powerful, centralized state. It doesn't matter how vast your armies are or how much external prestige you hold. If your leadership is weak, your financial system is broken, and your ruling class is self-interested, systemic destruction is assured.
It makes you wonder. We've seen how quickly internal cracks spread in the Mughal Empire. When we look at large institutions or even powerful countries today, which of these internal signs of fragility, weak and disengaged leadership, crippling financial strain, or a breakdown of system integrity leading to intense, self-interested factionalism do you think is the most dangerous sign of imminent collapse? Something for you to mull over as you digest this incredibly complex chapter of history until our next deep dive.